Now, let's go to something really cool. So I'm going to invite Sylvia and Tom and Pien, if Pien is here, from the Transnational Institute to make a presentation. I'm very proud of volume 2. So if you Google Science Open, Journal of Fair Trade, Atypical Fair Trade, you'll find such an amazing set of essays and case studies on things that you don't normally think of as being fair. Because in the public domain, there's been a capture of the concept of fair around a very specific set of problems and standards. Whereas in fact, fairness is like a really universal thing. And it's always been a bit of a beef for me because I've worked myself on so many different kinds of products that never would have had a hope in hell of being certified by anybody. So I recommend that. And I'm very grateful to the three of you for stepping up for this. So I'm going to hand over and you can explain why you think cannabis can be fair or needs to be fair, even better. Sylvia, do you want to load up?
Yes, I'll kick off. Hi, everyone. My name is Sylvia Kay and I work at the Transnational Institute, as Pauline mentioned. I'm really thrilled to be here. It's really nice of you to invite us. I'm here with my colleague, Tom Blickman. I think Pien unfortunately won't be able to make it. So I think it'll just be us two representing TNI on the call. Yeah, I just want to say, first of all, actually, it's really nice to be here and to collaborate with a journal such as the Journal of Fair Trade, which is open access and member run or member supported, because I think it fits very much with the ethos of TNI as a think tank that wants to popularize ideas and knowledge across the world of policy, practice, academia, and very much also the world of activism and social movements. Are one of our key audiences of the research that we do, which is a lot of it is collaborative research with social movements and grassroots organizations, is really to have that kind of accessibility of knowledge for those key audiences. So I think it's been a very nice collaboration also with that in mind. So Pauline asked me to sort of speak a bit around or present some of the key arguments of this article that we submitted as TNI, which I helped to write together with my colleague Martin Jelsma, and also David Bewley-Taylor, who's a close ally of TNI, but is based at the University of Swansea in Wales, in the UK. And the title of our article was called Fair Trade Cannabis, a roadmap for meeting the socio-economic needs and interests of small untraditional growers. And it was included, as Pauline had mentioned, in Volume 2, Issue 1, which was published in 2020, which was this kind of collection of articles dealing with kind of atypical fair trade products. So I prepared a little PowerPoint just to kind of talk through some of the kind of motivations and the context and the arguments in that article, which I thought would just be a nice kind of kickoff point for discussion. So I'll just share my screen. Here we go. From start, I think. Yeah. So the question I'm responding to is this question, can anything be traded fairly? The case for fair trade cannabis. And the article, I should say, was very much inspired by TNI's work over decades, as Pauline has mentioned, on this issue of drug policy and drug policy reform. And just to embed a bit TNI's research and approach in the production also of this article, we work across many different levels or scales. So we work at UN level on drug policy reform, particularly at this UN Committee on Narcotic Drugs, which is the key UN body dealing with drug policy making. We also convene what are called sort of international drug policy dialogues, which are kind of meetings where we convene, we play a convening role, organizing sort of Chatham House style meetings with drug policymakers from different countries and connecting them with other expert inputs and connecting them with grassroots organizations. And we very much work also with growers of illicit crops, not just cannabis, but also opium poppy, and coca. And we do that in different parts of the world. So that's kind of the triangulation of different spheres and scales at which TNI works on this particular issue. And it's led to a series of publications. I've just highlighted a few here that touch on the issue of cannabis, which also, some of which were referenced in the journal article. But yeah, what is the case that we try to put forward for thinking of cannabis in a kind of fair trade context? I think it really kind of centers on two key lines of argumentation. The first one is around recognizing the harms that the current, what's called global prohibitionist regime around drugs has engendered. And then the second is on the injustices, actually, that we see in the transition from illicit to licit markets. So the kind of injustice that we see in models of legal regulation of cannabis. So I'll just set out those two lines of argumentation very, very briefly. Obviously, I won't go into the whole colonial and racist roots of the current drug control regime, which kind of lay the foundation for prohibition. But very briefly, I mean, there is cannabis remains, as outlined in the 1961 UN Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs. It remains scheduled as an illegal and dangerous drug without any medical benefit or use value. And so this has really led to this kind of, ongoing illegal, illicit nature of cannabis, and which has meant that the livelihoods of millions of poor people around the world who depend on the cultivation of cannabis and other drug crops for their livelihoods, essentially their subsistence economies, their poverty has been criminalized, along with the ways in which cannabis has been used also in many traditional religious and cultural practices of communities around the world, particularly communities in the global south. It's led to it's led to violence and human rights violations that have accompanied this kind of militarized war on drugs and incarcerated millions for low-level drug offenses. It's sustained an extensive illicit market with profits concentrated in the hands of transnational organized crime groups. And it also has wasted resources. There's a huge opportunity cost to prohibition in terms of approaches, which is called alternative development, sort of approaches that have tried to offer alternative livelihoods for those that are engaged in the drug economy to licit, often agricultural activities. But in the case of cannabis, those approaches have really not been successful. And so there's been a big kind of, opportunity cost in terms of foregone income opportunities, and foregone opportunities also in the medical sphere of patient access to cannabis-based medicines. So that's kind of the harms of the kind of prohibitionist model, which has a huge cost to it. One would then assume that there's kind of the answer would be that a kind of switch to a what's called a regulated market or a legal market. And we have sort of seen in sort of particularly starting in sort of 2013 onwards, a kind of wave of shift towards legal regulation of cannabis in various jurisdictions, both for medical use and for what's called adult use or recreational or non-medical use. We've seen countries such as Uruguay in 2013, the US state of California in 2016, Canada notably in 2018, and many others have followed with various forms of regulation. But what have we seen with this switch to a legal market? We've seen what has been called this kind of green rush, which is a way to signify this kind of huge flood of investment, a lot of it corporate investment, into emerging licit cannabis markets, which really is, a lot of it has been sustained also by quite a bit of speculative capital. There's been a lot of booms and busts. And it's really concentrated profits and wealth into what is now the kind of global cannabis industry, dominated, as you see by this table, by companies from North America, principally the US and Canada. And you can see the kind of huge scale of profits, or at least market capitalization of some of those companies. And the question then is, how has this benefited those that have been previously criminalized by the war on drugs or global prohibition, and have they really been able to benefit from this transition to a regulated market? And that's kind of where this question of what would a fair trade cannabis model then look like. And the crux of the journal article that we submitted and which was published was really this argument that the focus of fair trade cannabis must be to empower small and traditional producers in the cannabis trade based on a number of first order principles, market strategies, and public policies. And a lot of the article kind of goes into further depth and detail of what those first order principles are, what those market strategies, some examples of those market strategies, and some examples of public policies. I won't go into full detail of all of them, just to say that a lot of the first order principles were inspired also by many of the principles of fair trade and that are laid out in the Fair Trade Charter. So principles around community empowerment, labor rights, issues of gender empowerment, fair pricing, obviously, this kind of notion of a social premium and investment in local community development, environmental justice. Those were kind of key principles that we hit. I did just want to then, because that's also then the in-depth, what the rest of the article goes into, we provide some examples to really show how some of those first order principles, those fair trade principles, if you wish, could be enacted. And we set out in a little bit in synthetic form in the article, but backed up with some examples, strategies for which public policies can be crafted to lessen the barriers to entry for small and traditional growers in the cannabis markets, and raise barriers to entries for example, bigger corporations and foreign investors that are trying to monopolize the space. And so we kind of go through and detail some of those more in depth in the article. I won't go into this table just now, but yeah, if you want to, you can read more in the article, and maybe my colleague Tom can also provide some examples if people are interested. But I thought it would be, I just wanted to end on this note of obviously challenges when it comes to thinking about cannabis from a perspective of fair trade or from a perspective of social and environmental justice. Because it is a very, challenging issue to think about. And I just wanted, this is not a non-exhaustive list, but this is just some of the challenges that I think are some of the main challenges that we've identified. I mean, obviously, and some of this is unique to the cannabis or an illicit product, and some of these may resonate with other more typical fair trade products and commodities. But in terms of cannabis, I mean, obviously we see ongoing stigma and criminalization. I mean, yes, there has been a wave of legal regulation, but there's still very much an entrenched, cultural and legal stigma and criminalization. There is the global prohibition hasn't ended, so there's very much cannabis at international level, at global level, remains an illegal substance. And so that makes this kind of trade component very difficult, highly complex. For example, it really is difficult to find jurisdictions as well in which cannabis can transit between the home country and the destination country. There are also issues around banking and finance, which are very complicated if countries don't have what are called correspondent banking regulations in place. So the whole flow of money and can be shut down. There's kind of whole issues around securitization, financing of crime and terrorism, which some of this links into. And as a result, actually, I don't have the exact figures, but very little actual international trade of cannabis has taken place as a result. I think a lot of countries are moving more towards an import substitution model rather than a trading model. Another huge issue is these costs of compliance for smaller growers in particular. There's a huge bureaucratic and regulatory hurdle that they need to clear to become licensed growers. And often many growers actually cite this kind of cumbersome bureaucracy as one of the main reasons they're shut out from legal markets. They have to invest in security cameras, they have to invest in fencing, they have to what's called do lots of administration around track and trace systems, because everything needs to be controlled at every step of the way in terms of the cannabis value chain. So there's a huge regulatory burden. There's also a lack of what I would call a kind of lack of strategic vision by governments and regulators. A lot of governments see cannabis mostly as just a way to attract investment. They don't see it as a development opportunity, and it's sort of invite investment first, ask questions later approach. There's not really a strategic vision and a proposal for how a cannabis market can develop more broadly beyond a sort of more extractivist model. And then I think, and this is perhaps particularly one I would also be curious to know a little bit more from the fair trade community about, is also this question is do cannabis consumers or cannabis patients care about ethically sourced cannabis? How does one foster that in that space? There's a whole plethora of kind of voluntary labeling and certification schemes in the cannabis industry, but it's quite unclear how those claims are verified. And it's also unclear, there's been a little bit of research, but it's also unclear to what extent there is a consumer demand for ethical, so-called ethical or fair trade cannabis. So that from the consumer side of things is also something worthwhile thinking a bit more about in terms of prospects for fair trade or fairer trade cannabis. So that's a little bit, I hope to have given a little bit of insight into the article. And if anyone has any questions, or Tom, if you want to add something more from some experiences you've been engaged in, I know in Morocco and in Germany, please also feel free.
Yeah. It's actually an interesting time around cannabis. It's a time full of paradoxes. Actually, cannabis is one of the most controlled commodities, or supposed to be one of the most controlled commodities in the world. Recreational cannabis is not allowed, so that shouldn't be there. And medical cannabis is very strictly controlled. But yeah, in practice, it's actually a free market, an illicit free market. And the discussion now is going from the prohibition-based regime towards the question whether or not cannabis should be legalized is more and more going to how should cannabis be legalized, and there the whole issue of trade and fairness in production comes into, and you have very, very strange things happening. So for instance, because of all the difficulties that Sylvia was already talking about, the conventions, is actually, in particular around recreational cannabis, there is no international trade officially. Between, of course, unofficially, there is a lot of international trade, smuggling going on for decades already. And what you can see happen now is that the countries who want to legally regulate cannabis are are doing so domestically. So because of all these complicated technical legal issues with the conventions and European law also, they basically say, well, we don't want this. We keep it completely domestical. So the production has to take place and the cultivation has to take place in country, and we're not going to allow import and export, which paradoxically has the effect that for a lot of, for instance, to give an example, in the Netherlands, there's now an experiment for regulating for regulated supply of cannabis to the coffee shops. And nowadays, or in the past, 20% of that market was still hashish coming from Morocco or Lebanon. But now to be able to be part of the regulation, producers have to produce hashish in order to cut off the illegal import from Morocco and Lebanon and other countries. So what you see happening is that actually illegal regulation leads to problems for the small traditional growers of cannabis who are now who have supplied that market for decades with a lot of risk for them, for themselves and their families and their livelihoods, and now are cut off of the new emerging regulated legal markets. So yeah, that's one of the issues we work a lot on how to deal with these complicated legal, technical, and complicated political questions there, that is something maybe a lot that is still not solved. And what you see happening now also is that because of the corporate capture of the market, you see, in fact, the intention was for the people who are in favor of legal regulation to actually decolonize the whole industry. But what is happening now, you see a recolonization. You see a lot of investment, for instance, in African countries now by North American or European companies first in the production of medical cannabis, and they get licenses from African governments. Well, that medical cannabis is only for export; it's not for the country, for the people in the country itself. And then it's also cutting off these markets, potentially these markets for traditional farmers to also enter that market. So yeah, for the moment it's a very confused transition period. We're actually in a limbo. There is no international agreement among countries that do want to legally regulate cannabis on how to go about with it. But basically, everybody is doing it on its own. There's for years, for decades, we were saying, well, if you want to do this, you have to form a like-minded group of countries and set up some kind of system that works, that is sustainable, and that is based on fair trade, that is environmentally friendly, and but nobody wants to go in there because they think it's a political risk in their international relations. Just to give some examples on what the difficulties are right now. But we also want to be positive. So there are more and more countries now saying that they're going to regulate cannabis, and it remains to be seen how that will develop. There are actually, broadly speaking, two models. One is based on what Sylvia was already explaining, a very expensive capitalist commercial model, But there's also another a model that is more based on public health and harm reduction approaches. And that's what you see, for instance, in Uruguay, where you can have either have home cultivation or you have collective cultivation in cannabis social clubs, or the state-controlled cannabis is sold through pharmacy. So that's a very strictly controlled market, and is not driven by corporate interest. And what you can see happening now in Europe, at least, it's going a little bit towards that model, and I think that is something to build on, and also try to engage European countries to start engaging countries from the global south, where there is traditional cannabis growing, to also allow them into these markets. Also because of environmental issues, why grow cannabis indoors with a lot of energy that is needed from these high volume lamps, when you can grow it outdoors in the sun in countries where that is possible. So
thank you, Tom. I'm going to stop you and
I can talk for hours.
I would welcome any contributions, because there are lots of really fascinating things in there, including what is the message of fair trade to consumers who consumes cannabis, and remembering that a large proportion of the new market, the illicit market, is medical, and does fair trade fit into things like that? So I'm just going to open it up, and really we won't be able to cover off lots of things, but I'm happy we got started, and please feel free to take up things directly with the team at TNI. So I've got Indro, you're in my top left-hand corner, then Meg.
Yes, I just wanted to make the comment, Sylvia mentioned that what do ethical consumers want? And I do think that this whole cannabis thing, consumer demand really drives it all. When you say cannabis, it's to me, it's a very funny word, because I'll tell you why. Right now, there's a huge demand for hemp fabric and anything made with hemp fabric, bags or shirts or clothing or whatever with hemp fabric. And hemp also comes from the cannabis plant. The difference is that the THC level of hemp is less than 0.3%. And if it's above 0.3%, then you smoke it instead of wearing it. That's the only difference. But really, the whole hemp fabric and hemp bags are coming from the same cannabis plant. And in India, for example, the whole cannabis hemp thing was banned by the government for years and years and years. And now, I don't know why, all of a sudden, they are allowing cannabis growing in some of the northern states, in some of the hilly states, and they're making hemp fabric, hemp fibers from that cannabis plant in small quantities, of course, and we are using that to make, bags and pouches and things like that, which is being fairly traded. And why is it being fairly traded? Because there is a huge demand for it from consumers, ethical consumers in America and in Europe. So this whole, these are demand-driven issues. Governments are smart enough to see that if there's enough consumers for something, they will want to regulate it and allow it, essentially. So, when I hear cannabis, to me, it's ironical because hemp is the in thing right now, and it's the same cannabis sativa plant, which, you grow it a little differently, you can smoke it.
Thank you, Indro. Meg.
Oh, thank you. That was fascinating. I had a question about the US is pretty confused with incarceration. My son works on wrongful incarceration cases a lot as a lawyer. I'm seeing there were still 250,000 arrests for marijuana possession in the US just last year. So I was just wondering, how that balances. I think this is fascinating. I think raising awareness about this is number one, about fair trade cannabis as all the problems that are caused by it not being. But just wondering also how you balance that with all the legality issues, really difficult. sorry, that's a really hard question.
Any more questions? And then we'll let Sylvia and Tom wrap up and try and answer or comment or ask for collaboration or whatever they want. Any more? I can't see any more hands. Okay, Sylvia, you there?
Yeah, and there I was just thinking how to respond. It is because it is a big question. I mean, so I think fair trade cannot advance without also, and also a commitment to restorative justice. I mean, especially for those that have been on the front lines of the war on drugs, and particularly low-income communities, minority communities, that have really been have suffered or borne the brunt of this kind of draconian approach. And so alongside kind of notions of fair trade, there has to be also we've seen a number of countries have done this, the kind of a commitment towards expungement of prior criminal records, or a kind of amnesty process to allow people to transition from the illicit to the licit market. Because you can't on one hand advance kind of notions of fair trade while you're still people are still fearful of persecution, of criminalization, of arrests, of other forms of intimidation and violence. So that is number one, restorative justice, expungement, amnesty, legal reform. But obviously that's a big package of a set of issues. Another is, the US in particular is a very complicated context, because you have, Tom will probably have the exact number at his fingertips, but something in the order of over 35 states have, in the US, have moved towards some kind of regulated market, either for medical or adult use cannabis. But of course, it remains prohibited at the federal level. And this creates this kind of quite interesting mishmash of what's models, which is problematic to some extent, but it's also helpful in the sense that you can kind of look towards more positive models which have emerged. I attended back in November. I was actually in the US for an event on cannabis and social justice, which looked at some of these models in different US states. And for example, the state of New Jersey, they have their model for regulated cannabis is that there's a commitment, and more than a commitment, a law, that 70% of the revenue that is collected from cannabis sales and the issuance of licenses, 70% of that revenue that is generated from that has to be invested back into either Black-owned or minority-owned businesses, as a recognition of the prior injustice and harm that was done by the previous model of illegality. So that is one model which is quite interesting, to popularize and uplift, and as one example. But what was also quite interesting at that meeting is that because the meeting also included small cannabis business owners and growers from the US, they were terrified of opening up. They were terrified of federal legalization, because in a weird way, having only cannabis legalized in particular states offered a level of protection for their particular markets, and so they were fearful of them being subjected to greater competition for what would then be called multi-state operators, larger commercial enterprises. And then a step further than that, if the US were then to be more open towards trade in international cannabis, they were then fearful of even greater competition from the global South. So there was a spirit and commitment to notionally to principles of social justice, but there was also this very much concern about what that would mean for, so the ways in which actually illegality can provide cover and protection in some ways for some, for some people as well.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, maybe on the issue of hemp is actually not illegal. So industrial hemp is excluded from the prohibitions in the convention. So yeah, it's easy to trade on that, and yeah, that might even also extend to CBD products for the medical market. This is also low THC and made from hemp. So yeah, there are opportunities there, and that might be a good testing ground for yeah, fair trade models there that then could eventually expand to the recreational market.
Thank you. All right. Thank you so much, TNI people. Of course, I have a vested interest. I should declare my conflict of interest. Until last October, I was the chair, but I'm not anymore. So I'm free of my conflict of interest. But at the time, I had a conflict, but I didn't review it.